Ever notice how, like, no matter how much you plan things out, something always seems to pop up that you just didn't, expect?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Happens all the time, whether it's, I don't know, a work project or even just planning a weekend getaway.
Mm-hmm.
There's always something, right?
Always. And that's especially true in aviation. Like even with all the checklists and procedures and planning that goes into it, even the most carefully planned flight can run into unexpected challenges once you're actually up in the air.
Right. Yeah.
And that's really what we're going to dig into today. How do pilots handle those unexpected issues, the mistakes that can happen in flight? We're calling this deep dive, managing the unexpected. Threats and errors in flight. And we've got some really fascinating material to work with here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's easy to think that once you're off the ground, the hard part is over. But the sources we've got here, they really show that in-flight operations, they come with a whole unique set of circumstances and a lot of potential for things to go differently than planned. So yeah, we're going to be looking at those challenges, what in aviation we call threats and errors and most importantly, how pilots defend against those to keep things safe.
Hmm.
All that real-time problem solving that happens in the cockpit.
And the material we've got, it actually lays out a really helpful framework. So we're talking about, like you said, threats, which are those factors that are outside the pilot's control, and then errors, which are actions or sometimes inaction on the part of the pilot, that can reduce those safety margins. And these can be intentional or unintentional. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
And the key is understanding how pilots defend against both of those to keep the flight safe and running smoothly. So let's start with those external factors, those threats. What are we talking about here?
Well, like the material emphasizes, these threats, they come from outside the crew's control. So these are things, events, or situations that can just make the flight more complex, more challenging. And often they pop up without any warning. Sometimes they need a really fast response. And what's really interesting is the sheer variety of these threats, the number of things that can potentially go wrong.
Yeah, the list from our sources here, it's pretty extensive. We're talking about things like a sudden system failure, maybe an engine problem, an issue with the flight controls, or even something unexpected happening with the autopilot or other automation.
Right.
And then, of course, you've got the environmental challenges, things like unexpected weather, which could be anything from thunderstorms to icing conditions that you weren't expecting.
Yeah, exactly. And then, on top of the aircraft itself and the weather, you've also got to think about the whole operational environment. So pilots might run into risks of collision, not just with other planes, but with birds, wildlife on or near the runway.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the possibility of visibility suddenly getting worse. You get fog, haze, other atmospheric conditions that can really reduce how far you can see.
Or think about the logistics, right? So you're en route, you get information that the airport you were planning to land at is suddenly closed, or maybe a runway or a taxiway is out of service. The sources even mention like less obvious hazards, like poor braking action on the runway that wasn't reported, or surface contamination, ice, snow, standing water, that sort of thing. Even vital equipment can fail, right? Like a radio navigation aid could go on the fritz after takeoff.
Yeah. And then, we've also got to consider the air traffic control system itself, because that can be a source of threats too. So you could have unexpected changes to your clearance, new restrictions, reroutes, and that can really pile on the workload for the pilot. And while it doesn't happen as often, there's also the potential for, controllers to make mistakes, or you could have radio congestion, making it hard to communicate, or even a complete loss of radio communication.
And it's not just what's going on outside the plane, right? Because events inside the cabin, those can pose a threat too.
Right.
It could be anything from a passenger having a medical emergency to disruptive behavior, unruly passengers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. It really runs the gamut.
It does. And then the sources highlighted one threat that I thought was particularly interesting because it's not as obvious, and that's the possibility of the aircraft being improperly refueled or even the fuel supply being contaminated somehow.
Yeah, that's a big one. And it might not be immediately apparent, which makes it even more dangerous.
Right, exactly. So it's really a whole spectrum of potential issues that can come up at any point during the flight. And the key takeaway here, I think, is that while pilots can't prevent these things from happening, it's their ability to manage them effectively that keeps those risks, at an acceptable level.
Exactly. It's all about how you respond.
And that brings us to the other side of the coin, which is errors.
Right.
So if threats are those external challenges, those unexpected things that pop up, then errors are instances where the pilot, for whatever reason, deviates from what they were supposed to do, from the correct course of action. And it's important to point out, like the material does, that errors, they don't necessarily need a threat to happen.
Yeah.
They can just happen on their own. And when they do, well, they can introduce confusion and definitely increase the workload up there in the cockpit.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what's really insightful is looking at why these errors happen in the first place. What are the root causes?
Yeah.
And the sources we've got, they break those causes down in a way that's really helpful. So one big area is just not having enough training or experience.
Right.
Imagine a pilot who's encountering a certain type of bad weather for the first time, or maybe they have to deal with a system malfunction they've never seen before. They might simply not have the knowledge or the practical experience to handle it in the best way.
Makes sense. It's like any complex skill, right? You need the right training, you need enough practice to deal with those unfamiliar situations smoothly and correctly.
Yeah, you gotta have those tools in your toolbox.
Right. And another factor that the material highlights is inadequate flight planning or preparation. And they give a really clear example of this with the pilot in Vermont.
You got this pilot who decides to fly back to White Plains after not being able to get fuel in Vermont.
Yeah.
And the decision to keep going with potentially not enough fuel and then filing that flight plan while they're already in the air and then they run into a snowstorm and airport closures, it really points to a potential lack of thorough planning beforehand. Like they didn't do a good enough risk assessment, or have backup plans in place.
Right. Yeah.
It really shows how important it is to get all the information you need before you even take off and to think through those what ifs, those potential risks.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that an oversight in the planning stage can really snowball into a much bigger problem once you're in the air and lead to bad decisions under pressure. Then the sources talk about physiological effects, which I think is really interesting because it brings in that human element of piloting.
Right.
We're not just machines up there.
Right. And this ties in directly to the I'm Safe checklist that pilots use to make sure they're fit to fly.
Yeah.
Each letter stands for something important.
Yeah.
So you've got illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And any of those things can really affect a pilot's ability to stay focused, react quickly, and make good decisions. Even something as simple as not getting enough sleep before a flight can make errors more likely.
And it's not just about our overall physical and mental state, right?
Yeah.
Because the sources also talk about how our senses and perception can be limited, and that can lead to errors too.
Right.
Like being able to spot another aircraft that might be on a collision course. It's not just about scanning the sky, it's also about your visual acuity, the techniques you use to scan, and how your brain is processing all that visual information in that moment.
Right, exactly. All those factors come into play. And that leads us to psychological effects. This is where we really get into how our state of mind can influence what we do in the cockpit. So stress and emotion, those are big contributors to errors. Even if a pilot has, gone through the I'm Safe checklist and everything before the flight, there can be these external pressures, maybe they want to arrive on time or they're feeling pressure from passengers. And that can lead to this tendency to prioritize just finishing the flight as planned, even when safety might be at risk.
It's that tug of war, isn't it, between wanting to stick to the plan and knowing that you need to put safety first.
Yeah.
And like the source points out, even just spontaneous emotions or a pilot's general state of mind, being super fixated on one thing during the flight and ignoring other things, or the opposite, being too complacent, not alert enough, those can all increase the chances of an error.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance,
Yeah.
that sweet spot of focus and attention.
Right. And then there's expectation bias. That's a really interesting one. That's kind of sneaky, isn't it?
It is, yeah. This is where a pilot's initial thought, what they think is going on, even if it's wrong, it just sticks.
Yeah.
Even when there's clear evidence that it's not right. The source has a couple of really good examples of this.
Yeah, like that case of the Boeing 737 that landed at the wrong airport at night.
Oh, right.
Because the crew, they expected the first airport they saw to be theirs, even though their instruments were probably telling them something different. It's a good reminder of how powerful that expectation can be. And then there was the general aviation pilot who kept thinking a runway closure was in the old configuration,
Yeah.
even after they'd seen the updated NOTAM. It shows how we sometimes see what we expect to see, even when it's not really there.
Yeah, and then you've got this related thing called confirmation bias, where pilots might unconsciously favor information that supports what they already believe and kind of downplay or ignore anything that contradicts it. And the material says that fatigue can make pilots even more vulnerable to these biases. They might not be as likely to double-check things or look for evidence that goes against what they're thinking. And they also mentioned the incident at San Francisco International, KSFO, as another example of how expectation bias can contribute to a major event. And they point readers to the NTSB docket if they want to dig into that more.
That's fascinating. And it's not just in the air that this can happen, right?
No, not at all.
Because the source mentions that expectation bias can even happen on the ground, like during taxiing. A pilot who's really familiar with an airport might hear the taxi clearance they were expecting instead of the actual instructions they were given, especially if the frequency is busy.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then finally, within psychological effects, the material touches on personality. It basically reminds us that pilots, like everyone, have different personalities, and those can influence how they react to unexpected threats. So a pilot who's more impulsive might react too quickly without really assessing the situation fully, whereas a pilot who's more passive or resigned, they might not respond quickly enough. And both of those extremes can lead to more workload, more confusion, and just a failure to deal with the situation effectively.
So we've talked about threats, those external challenges and errors, which are the pilot's own actions or inactions.
Right.
And now our sources bring up another concept, this idea of an undesired aircraft state. So what exactly does that mean?
Well, an undesired aircraft state, it basically happens because of a flight crew error. It's when the aircraft isn't where it's supposed to be, or it's not configured the way it should be. So this could be like incorrect airspeed, altitude, flap settings, things like that. It can also be a situation where the pilots get disoriented and the workload goes way up. And most importantly, those safety margins get smaller.
Oh, I see.
The aircraft becomes more vulnerable to the threats and errors we've already been talking about.
So it's like a knock-on effect of an error.
Right.
It puts the plane in a less safe situation.
Exactly. It's like, imagine a car drifting out of its lane because of something the driver did.
Right.
It's not an accident yet, but it's definitely not as safe.
That makes sense. So given all these potential threats and errors and these resulting undesired states, what kind of defenses do pilots have to work with, once they're up in the air? What can they do to stay safe?
That's the key question.
Yeah.
And our sources, they point out that these defenses, they fall into two main categories. So there are defenses that are provided to the pilot or crew, and then there are those that the pilot or crew actively use themselves.
Okay.
So let's start with the defenses that are provided. These are often put in place by the aircraft manufacturers, the airlines, or flight school.
Right, like checklists, for example. Those are essential, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Foundational, you could say.
And then you've got the operating limitations for that specific type of aircraft and the minimum qualifications that a pilot needs to have to fly it, and those standard operating procedures, the SOPs. Those provide a standardized way of doing all those flight-related tasks. Even insurance requirements can be seen as a kind of defense that's already in place.
Yeah, for sure. All those things, they form these basic layers of safety that are there even before the flight starts.
Right.
And the source specifically talks about how important those manufacturer-provided checklists are and the placards you see in the cockpit that have all that vital information and the emergency procedures. Those are key defenses against all sorts of problems. And then a lot of aviation organizations and pilot groups, they build on those. They have their own more detailed checklists, SOPs, that are tailored to their specific operation or aircraft, and they share recommended best practices.
Right. It's good to know there's that layered approach. What about resources that are available, while you're actually in flight?
Yeah, well, even when you've got a single pilot, there are often resources they can use. The source mentions the possibility of, flying with another pilot who can help with the workload and basically provide another set of eyes and ears, or even giving certain tasks to a passenger, things that aren't critical like reading items off a checklist. But as the material points out, you've got to be careful about how you integrate extra people into the cockpit. Because if you don't manage it well, they could actually create new threats or distractions.
That's a good point. More people doesn't automatically equal more safety. What about external resources, people that the pilot can rely on?
Well, you've got flight service personnel. They're a huge help to pilots because they provide updated weather information, they can help with changing flight plans while you're in the air, and they offer other important information. And then, of course, there's air traffic control, or ATC. They play a vital role in helping pilots avoid other aircraft, and they provide information about weather, terrain, and navigation.
Hmm.
But it's important to remember that ATC can only do so much. They have their own workload, and there might be limitations with their equipment or radar coverage.
Right, yeah.
And then in bigger operations like airlines and corporate flights, the pilots also have access to dispatch or a company operations center, which can coordinate communication and provide support.
So there are definitely those external safety nets, but at the end of the day, a lot of the responsibility for safety rests on the pilot themselves, what they do in the cockpit.
Exactly.
So what kind of defenses do they actively provide?
Well, there are certain behaviors that are really crucial in defending against threats and errors. Clear communication is fundamental, whether it's a single pilot talking to ATC or a multi-person crew doing their pre-flight briefing or talking about changes in flight conditions. Being able to communicate clearly, say what you intend to do, and actively listen, ask for clarification when you need it, and question anything that doesn't seem right, that's the very foundation of staying safe in the air.
Yeah, it sounds so basic, but in the cockpit, where things can be so fast-paced and the stakes are so high, that clear communication must be so important for preventing misunderstandings that could lead to errors. What other active defenses are there? What else is crucial for pilots to do?
Maintaining good situational awareness is right up there with communication. And this means more than just knowing where you are, right? It's about having this mental picture of the aircraft's position, where it's supposed to be going, what the other aircraft around you are doing, the weather conditions, and even being aware of those human factors that might be affecting the flight, like fatigue or stress levels within the crew.
So it's about having that big picture, understanding everything that's happening around you and how it might all interact and potentially affect the safety of the flight.
Exactly. You got to have the whole picture.
And that leads naturally to the next point, right? Proactively planning for what's coming next.
Absolutely. So with good situational awareness,
Yeah.
a pilot can anticipate what's going to happen and stay ahead of the aircraft.
Right.
So by planning ahead, you're much more likely to spot any deviations from what you expect and intervene early before a small problem turns into a big one.
That makes sense. If you're thinking a step ahead, you're less likely to be caught off guard.
Exactly.
Time management also seems like a really important skill, especially in the air.
Oh, absolutely. It's huge because on the ground, if you have a problem, you can usually stop and take your time to fix it. But in the air, you can't exactly pause the flight, right? So managing your time well, prioritizing tasks, or even intentionally slowing the aircraft down when you need to, that can give you the mental and physical space to do things accurately and carefully, which reduces the chances of rushing and making mistakes.
Makes sense.
The source gives the example of a pilot feeling rushed during an approach, and they ask ATC for a delay.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of time management in action.
Right. And then in multi-pilot operations, effective teamwork is obviously a big part of it.
Yeah, for sure. Teamwork, or what's often called crew resource management, or CRM, is absolutely vital when you've got more than one pilot. And this means more than just dividing up the tasks, where you have one pilot flying the plane and the other handling navigation and communication. It's also about making sure both pilots are talking to each other, explaining their thinking, what they intend to do, and what actions they're taking. This creates an environment where you can have discussion, agreement, and verification of actions.
Right.
And even for single pilot operations, those principles of teamwork, they still apply. You've got to communicate well with external resources like flight service and ATC. And it's crucial to know when to declare an emergency to get the help you need.
So it's about recognizing that you're not alone, even if you are the only pilot in the cockpit. The sources also mention automation management as a defense.
Yeah, they point out that using automation the right way can definitely reduce the pilot's workload and help with situational awareness in a lot of situations. But they also say that automation is a whole other topic that they'll cover in more detail later, which I think is important because it's not a magic solution. You have to understand it and use it correctly for it to be an effective defense.
Makes sense. And then there's what the source calls flying skills, the last resort. That sounds pretty serious.
It is. This defense comes into play when you have an undesired aircraft state that you can't fix any other way. Automation doesn't work, procedures don't work. So the pilot has to be able to take manual control of the aircraft and get it back to a safe flight condition.
Right.
So it really emphasizes how important those basic flying skills are, even in today's airplanes, with all the fancy technology. And the material makes a good point that good risk management and threat and error management, those should ideally prevent situations where a pilot has to rely on their raw flying skills to avoid disaster.
So it's a crucial backup, but not something you want to be using all the time.
Right, exactly.
The material also really emphasizes the importance of staying proficient as a key defense.
Yeah, absolutely. A
Right.
pilot who's constantly training, doing those recurrent checks and practicing, they're just better prepared to spot threats early on, catch and fix errors quickly, and recover effectively from any undesired aircraft states that might happen. And the source uses this great analogy of the Swiss cheese model.
Oh, right.
So you can think of each layer of safety defense as having these holes in it, like Swiss cheese. And those holes represent weaknesses. And the more proficient a pilot is, the smaller those holes are. There are fewer of them, so it's less likely that all the holes will line up and lead to an incident or accident.
That's a great way to visualize it. So the more skilled and current you are, the fewer and smaller those vulnerabilities become in your safety cheese.
Exactly. And then finally, the sources talk about the role of discipline as a defense.
Mm-hmm.
And discipline, in this context, it comes from that initial training you get in developing good, safe habits.
Right.
So a disciplined pilot is going to follow procedures and best practices every single time, no matter how routine or familiar the task is or how good they feel that day, that pre-flight checklist, for example.
Mm-hmm.
A disciplined pilot is going to use it thoroughly before every single flight. And discipline is also crucial when it comes to making good decisions. It helps pilots avoid those hazardous attitudes and operational traps, and to make the right choices, even when it might be tempting to take shortcuts or do things differently. And much like proficiency, discipline acts as a barrier, making it less likely that a threat or error will find a way through all those other defenses that are in place.
So it's about doing the right thing even when no one's watching.
Yeah,
And actively fighting complacency. That's a really powerful takeaway.
it is. And when you consider all of these defenses together, both the ones that are provided and the ones that the pilot develops and uses actively, it really makes you appreciate all those layers of safety that are built into every flight.
Absolutely. So to put it all together, pilots are constantly managing threats and errors from the moment they start the flight until they land safely. They're using a combination of built-in safety features and their own skills, their awareness, and their discipline. It's an ongoing process where anticipating problems, recognizing them when they happen, and knowing how to recover effectively are all key.
Exactly. And I think by understanding these concepts, our listeners can really gain a deeper appreciation for how complex flight operations are and all the effort that goes into keeping air travel safe. It's so much more than just getting from point A to point B. It's this constant dance of identifying risks and working to reduce them at every stage of the flight.
It really is fascinating when you break it all down like this.
It is.
So as you go about your day-to-day life, maybe as you're planning a trip or working on a project, I encourage you to think about how these principles of threat and error management might apply to your own experiences. Can you identify those potential threats that could pop up in your daily routine? What kind of errors are you prone to making when you're stressed or tired? And what are your own personal defenses, those routines, checklists, support systems that help you deal with all that complexity and keep you on track? It's definitely something to think about.
Food for thought.
Yeah, definitely.